You ready? Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kavan Small. You can have a seat, thank you. I'm the director of the Office for Civil Rights in the Justice Department's Office of Justice Programs. The Office for Civil Rights, in coordination and collaboration with the Department's Civil Rights Division, ensures recipients of federal financial assistance are not engaging in discrimination prohibited by law. On behalf of the department, I have the privilege and the honor of welcoming you to today's program commemorating the 60th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. We welcome all of you in the audience, both here and online, including our colleagues from DOJ who work to uphold the values and mandates of this act every day. The Civil Rights Act stands as a powerful declaration of our nation's commitment to equal justice under law. We are here today to celebrate its legacy, but also to recommit ourselves to the work that remains in fulfilling its promise. Many of us here are charged with enforcing the provisions of this landmark piece of legislation, and every one of us, in some way, embodies its principles. The Justice Department played a special role in securing passage of the Civil Rights Act. And like many of you, I feel a strong personal and professional connection to this history. Nicholas Katzenbach, who as Deputy Attorney General helped lead the department's civil rights work. He chaired the commission that conceived of a federal office responsible for supporting equal justice and public safety in America's communities. That office went on to become the Office of Justice Programs, where I am so proud to work today. Many in this room can draw similar connections. In truth, we all can lay a special claim to the achievements and the responsibilities associated with the Civil Rights Act. We are honored to be joined today by distinguished speakers who will reflect on the meaning and the unfinished work of the law. We'll hear from Justice Department leadership and from a distinguished panel of experts working on the front lines of civil rights policy and enforcement. To begin today's observance, we'll hear opening remarks from 5 leaders at the Department of Justice: Attorney General Merrick Garland, Deputy Attorney General Lisa Monaco, Acting Associate Attorney General Ben Miser, and the head of the Community Relations Service, Justin Locke. Attorney General Garland and Deputy Attorney General Monaco have to leave us early for prior commitments, but we know they are leaving us in great hands with today's lineup of speakers. We will also see the Attorney General Garland later this afternoon for the post-program reception. Throughout his leadership, the Attorney General has spoken of equal justice as a pillar of our mission at the Department of Justice and as central to our founding charter. His deep commitment is reflected in his support of the work of our Civil Rights Division and offices like mine across DOJ that strive to make real the promise of the Civil Rights Act. Please join me in welcoming the Attorney General of the United States, the Honorable Merrick B. Garland.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Kavan, for that introduction and for your leadership of the Office for Civil Rights and the Office of Justice Programs. I'm honored to welcome everyone to this program, marking the 60th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. 61 years ago, our country not only watched, but finally truly saw the generations-long struggle by Black Americans to claim the rights guaranteed to them by the Constitution. In May of 1963, the country saw young, nonviolent protesters participating in a desegregation campaign in Birmingham, Alabama, face heinous violence at the direction of Bull Connor. The country saw public safety officers blast students and organizers with water from fire hoses so powerful that they could rip the bark off trees. The country saw children who sought only to be treated as equal under the law, loaded into school buses and taken to jail. And as the country finally began to see that the treatment of its Black citizens undermined its founding promise of equality under the law, the United States Justice Department saw it too. So on Saturday in May, a Saturday in May of 1963, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, for whom this building is named, called a meeting here at the Justice Department. By the end of the 5-hour meeting, covering everything from education to employment to public accommodations, the Attorney General asked Justice Department lawyers to draft a civil rights bill. Just 2 days later, by Monday night, they had one. And just over a year later, on July 2nd, 1964, after a hard-fought struggle in Congress and across the country, the bill was signed into law. It would be difficult to overstate the significance of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It outlawed segregation in public accommodations. It banned discrimination based on race, religion, color, sex, and national origin in the workplace and at schools. And it banned certain barriers to voting and laid the groundwork for future voting rights legislation. The act transformed our country. It also gave the Justice Department some of its most important tools to protect American civil rights. The 60th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 presents an important moment to reflect on why we needed this law in 1964 and why we still need it today. Although there is so much for us to be proud of on this anniversary, we know there is so much more to do. Over half a century has passed, but many of the challenges that necessitated the Civil Rights Act of 1964 are still with us. Over the past 3 years, the Justice Department has exercised our authorities under the Act to participate in more than 130 school desegregation cases across the country, to protect students from harassment based on race and sex in schools and communities ranging from Vermont and Kentucky to Wyoming and Kansas, to end practices in Lowndes County, Alabama, that disproportionately expose the county's black residents to raw sewage, to protect voters in Arizona from unlawful voter registration requirement, to pursue justice for female corrections officers who faced sexual harassment in the workplace in Alabama, to pursue justice for black firefighter candidates who faced discriminatory hiring practices in Georgia, to hold accountable the owners and operators of a hotel in South Dakota that effectively banned Native Americans from the property, and to facilitate intercommunity dialogue and trainings under the auspices of the Department's Community Relations Service, which was created by the Civil Rights Act. These examples are just a fraction of the work that the Justice Department has been doing to enforce the protections of the Civil Rights Act. These examples are also just a fraction of the attempts to undermine civil rights protections that we are currently confronting. Today, it is not just individual civil rights that are under attack. We are also seeing pervasive attacks on the laws that guarantee those rights. And we are seeing a disturbing rise in attacks on the institutions and the people who are charged with enforcing those laws. We see this most clearly when it comes to voting rights. The right to vote is the cornerstone of our democracy, the right from which all others flow. But around the country, there has been an increase in legislative measures that make it harder for eligible voters to vote, to have those votes counted, and to elect the representatives of their choice. Some have even suggested giving state legislatures the power to set aside the choice of the voters themselves. These efforts threaten the very foundation of our system of government. Efforts to undermine the right to vote have also expanded to include a disturbing rise in threats of violence against the citizens we rely on to fairly administer voting: state and county elected officials, career administrators, and even volunteer poll workers. These threats of violence against those who serve the public come alongside continued violence and threats of violence directed at people solely because of who they are, where they are from, what they look like, whom they love, how they worship, or what they believe. This is not the way our democracy is supposed to work. The promise of our democracy is that individuals will not have to fear that the color of their skin or where they work or who they are will make them targets of violence. The promise of our democracy is that public servants will be able to do their jobs without fearing for their safety. The promise of our democracy is that all people will be protected in the exercise of their civil rights and in the peaceful expression of their opinions, beliefs, and ideas. In a democracy, people vote, argue, and debate, often loudly, in order to achieve the policy outcomes they desire. But the promise of our democracy is that people will not employ violence to affect those outcomes. The promise of our democracy is that every one of our citizens will recognize the inherent dignity and equality of every other. And critically, the promise of our democracy is that all people will be protected and treated equally under the law. Working to fulfill that promise is part of the historical inheritance of this department. The Justice Department's first principal task upon its founding in the wake of the Civil War in 1870 was to protect the civil rights guaranteed by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. This meant confronting white supremacists who use extraordinary violence and threats of violence to prevent Black Americans from exercising their voting rights. In the next few years, DOJ lawyers successfully prosecuted hundreds of members of the Ku Klux Klan. Those efforts helped to secure a brief period of meaningful Black voting rights in parts of the former Confederacy. But the federal commitment to protecting Black voting rights waned as Reconstruction drew to a close. Many people in this room will tell you that I speak often about the importance of the Justice Department's founding and about how its charge to protect the civil rights of all Americans continues to guide us to this day. But the near century of inaction that followed the department's founding, in which the federal government failed to meaningfully protect civil rights, is also a history we must remember. It is a history we must never repeat. And that is why this program is so important. We have seen attacks on civil rights before. We have seen the courageous struggle of Americans who successfully moved this country closer to its promise. And we have seen the backlash against those efforts. Since its founding, the Justice Department has been at its best when it stands firmly on the side of protecting civil rights. And that is a legacy we recommit ourselves to today. That legacy is an important reason why I returned to the Justice Department 3.5 years ago after serving for more than 2 decades as a judge. I loved being a judge. But my job as a judge was to decide only the cases that were randomly assigned to me, faithfully applying the law to the facts, and in that way to do my part to ensure the rule of law. But in 2020, along with the rest of the country and the world, I watched as Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd were senselessly taken from their loved ones and their communities. I know that the feeling of despair I felt at that time reflected just a fraction of the grief and devastation felt and still felt by their families and by Black Americans all across this country. But in the wake of those tragedies, I questioned whether what I was doing with the time given to me was enough. So when given the chance, I came back to the Justice Department. I came back to this place with its history of stepping up for equal justice when it was needed the most. And that is what the Justice Department is doing today. As we continue to enforce the provisions of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, we are using every authority we have to protect civil rights. We are using our authorities to ensure constitutional policing by pursuing accountability on both an individual and systemic level. We are doing everything in our power to defend reproductive rights protected by federal law. We are enforcing the laws prohibiting lending discrimination, and we are securing relief for victims of that discrimination. We are using every authority we have to protect the right to vote. We are aggressively disrupting, investigating, and prosecuting the hate crimes that victimize individuals and terrorize entire communities. And we are bringing the perpetrators of those crimes to justice. We are using the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and other authorities to protect the rights of LGBTQ Americans to live free from discrimination, harassment, and violence. And we are prosecuting threats of violence that target the public servants who administer our elections and who ensure the functioning of our democracy. We will not back down in our effort to defend civil rights and to defend our democracy. We recognize the challenges of this moment, but we have faced such challenges before. And with the help and often the push we needed from the civil rights community, we have risen to meet them. Ensuring the rule of law and making real the promise of equal justice under law are the principles upon which this department was founded. They are the principles the Civil Rights Act of 1964 affirmed 60 years ago, and they are the principles for which the United States Department of Justice stands today. During today's program, you will hear more about what the Justice Department is doing to continue the work of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. I want to express my gratitude to the public servants across the department who advanced that work, particularly the Civil Rights Division, led by Assistant Attorney General Kristen Clark, the Community Relations Service, led by Component Head Justin Locke, and the Office of Justice Programs, led by Assistant Attorney General Amy Solomon. I also want to thank Shaylin Cochran. In my office for her outstanding work leading the committee that put together today's event, and for her effort every day helping to lead our work to protect civil rights. And I'm deeply grateful to the department's leadership team, to the Deputy Attorney General Lisa Monaco and Acting Associate Attorney General Ben Miser, both of whom you will hear from in just a moment. I am proud to work with all of you. And now I would like to ask the Deputy Attorney General to deliver her remarks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Attorney General. And what a wonderful reason to see this great hall filled, standing room only. I can think of no better reason for us to gather in this great hall. It is a pleasure and an honor to join all of you for this celebration. In June of 1963, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy appeared before the House Judiciary Committee to advocate for the passage of the Civil Rights Act. To open that hearing, he said, "In this generation, we have seen an extraordinary change in America, a new surge of idealism in our life, a new and profound insistence on reality in our democratic order. Much has been done, but quite obviously, much more must be done, both because the American people are clearly demanding it and because, by any moral standard, it is right. A year later, after a long, hard fight, the Civil Rights Act became the law of the land. And today it remains the bedrock of our work to promote equal justice under the law. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 is a story of how the Department of Justice not only addressed the inequities of the present, but also how it anticipated those of the future. Guided by our nation's civil rights leaders and organizers, the department dared to look ahead, imagining what equal treatment under the law meant in public life, from education to employment and beyond. As we celebrate 60 years of the Civil Rights Act, it's vital to acknowledge how far we've come, and even more important, though, to acknowledge that our work is unfinished. The extraordinary change in America that Attorney General Kennedy described in 1963 has only hastened. Our progress is evident. The passage of the Civil Rights Act was a watershed moment in our country's march toward a more perfect union, outlawing segregation in public accommodations and banning discrimination in public schools and in the workplace. But of course, as we know all too well, discrimination persists. Indeed, we have much more to do to stop hate, intolerance, and bias from being exacerbated and, indeed, accelerated, including by technology. The architects in 1964 could not have anticipated how misuses of technology, from cybercrime and artificial intelligence to social media algorithms and beyond, how they could pose a threat to the very rights and opportunities protected by the Civil Rights Act and successor legislation like the Voting Rights Act. And we've seen it when folks search for a home, apply for a job, receive medical care, and in too many other instances. We've seen how it can crack open a window for foreign adversaries and bad actors to divide and mislead voters, threatening their most fundamental right, the right to vote. But 60 years later, because of the Civil Rights Act, bias fueled by automated systems is still bias. Hate accelerated by advanced algorithms is still hate. And discrimination enabled by artificial intelligence is still discrimination. More than half a century after its passage, the Civil Rights Act still offers the framework and legal tools to protect those whose civil rights are threatened by whatever comes next. And as a department, we understand and accept our responsibility to lead on evolving issues that impact basic rights. It's why our Civil Rights Division fights every single day against discrimination in all its forms, including when it's enabled by technology. That's why the department secured a landmark settlement against Meta for the discriminatory use of algorithms to serve up housing ads based on protected characteristics like race and sex. That's why the Civil Rights Division has led 9 federal agencies to commit to core principles of fairness, equality, and justice as emerging technologies like AI become more common. And that's why Assistant Attorney General Clark is coordinating civil rights enforcement across the federal government to execute on the President's executive order on artificial intelligence. And as we confront the most transformational technology in our history, artificial intelligence, we're engaging civil rights advocates and leaders through the Justice AI Initiative, an effort launched earlier this year to draw on varied perspectives as we prepare for how AI will affect the Justice Department's mission today and in the future. On that June day back in 1963, Attorney General Kennedy ended his remarks by saying, This bill springs from the people's desire to correct a wrong that has been allowed to exist too long in our society. It comes from the basic sense of justice in the hearts of all Americans. The anniversary we mark today represents this department at its very best, seeing past wrongs and righting them. Today, we also recognize and reaffirm our responsibility to keep pushing that work forward and to meet the current moment. Thanks to all of you, colleagues, advocates, leaders, organizers, for your commitment to advance the promise of the Civil Rights Act and for lighting the path ahead. With that, I'd like to invite Acting Associate Attorney General Ben Miser to say a few words.
Thank you, Deputy Attorney General Monaco. As we gather to celebrate and reflect on the Civil Rights Act of 1964, we have to start by acknowledging the debt we owe to the countless individuals whose tireless efforts and unyielding bravery were critical in the fight to dismantle deeply ingrained systems of discrimination and segregation. We are here today because of their struggle, sacrifice, and courage. 60 years ago, in his remarks on signing the act, President Johnson recognized that millions of Americans were being deprived, as he put it, of the blessings of liberty. The purpose of the landmark Civil Rights Act was, he said, to promote a more abiding commitment to freedom, a more constant pursuit of justice, and a deeper respect for human dignity. We have made great strides since that time, but we must never let up in our constant pursuit of justice. As the Attorney General and Deputy Attorney General have highlighted, the Act gave this Justice Department critical tools to protect American civil rights, and we have heard about some of what the department has accomplished by using those tools. I also want to take this moment to highlight some of the enforcement work we've done in partnership with others, as well as some of the work beyond enforcement that the Act has empowered us to do. In so much of our important enforcement efforts under the Civil Rights Act, the Justice Department has worked alongside valued partners, including our colleagues at other federal agencies and outside civil rights organizations. And we are grateful to have so many of those partners in the room today. For instance, we have worked with the Department of Education to combat harassment and discrimination that limit students' opportunities based on race, national origin, sex, religion, and disability. And to address harassment and discrimination in the workplace, we have partnered with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or EEOC, which was itself created by the Civil Rights Act. These and many more partnerships illustrate how the Justice Department is working with our esteemed partners to achieve broad enforcement of the Act's protections. But enforcement tools were never going to be enough to make good on all of the promises of the Act. So Congress also created the Community Relations Service, or CRS, to be America's peacemaker. CRS's conciliation specialists are trained to empower communities to mitigate tensions and develop frameworks for reconciliation, signaling just how central that work was and is in advancing the goals of the Act. President Johnson said in his signing remarks that his very first step in implementing the Act was to nominate the first director of CRS. So today, we also celebrate 60 years of CRS's service in proactively helping to resolve conflict in communities across the nation. For the last 60 years, CRS conciliators have been both on the front lines and behind the scenes, providing mediation and facilitation services at most of our nation's major civil rights conflicts. In 1965, when Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference led a march on Selma in support of black suffrage, CRS was there, mediating between demonstrators and law enforcement along the route. In 2014, when protests took place in Ferguson and across the country against inequalities in the criminal justice system, CRS was there. And in 2020, when Americans took to the streets in numbers not seen in decades to protest racial injustice, CRS was there, working in communities across the country to help stakeholders. CRS has worked to reduce racial tensions in schools and helped foster supportive and inclusive learning environments across the country. And through its expanded authority under the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act, CRS is helping communities prevent and respond to hate crimes and other incidents of bias. The alchemy of peacemaking is tricky and demanding, but it was and continues to be an indispensable component of securing the promises of the Act, and CRS has always been up to the task and continues to be so today under Justin's tremendous leadership. As we spend the rest of the day reflecting on how the Civil Rights Act of 1964 shaped our country for the last 60 years, may we renew our shared commitment and partnership to fulfilling its mandate and our country's promise of equality for all. Thank you.
So first, I would like to thank Attorney General Garland, Deputy Attorney General Monaco, and Acting Associate Attorney General Miser for your powerful, thoughtful, and inspiring remarks. Before we return to our speakers, we have a short video documenting the history of the Civil Rights Act that we are pleased to share with you. So as you can see, the screen's going to come on down. It's going to take its time, but it's going to come down. And then the video will start.